The grand ballroom was drowning in light. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. The laughter of wealthy guests rolled like waves, and glasses clinked to the rhythm of shallow conversations. Robert, sharp suit, sharper tongue, stood in the center like a king surveying his court. He was a millionaire, and he carried that fact on his shoulders like a crown. Every word he spoke, every smirk he threw had weight. People laughed too quickly at his jokes, nodded too eagerly at his opinions. But tonight he was restless. He wanted entertainment, something to feed his arrogance. His eyes drifted to the far end of the hall, where the piano sat. Glossy black, polished so perfectly it caught the candlelight like a mirror. Beside it stood John, the caretaker, a quiet man, dressed plainly, head slightly bowed as if he didn't belong in this world of silk gowns and gold cufflinks. He was invisible to most, carrying trays, fixing small things, fading into the background. But Robert's eyes locked on him like a hunter spotting prey. "John," Robert called, his voice slicing through the hum of chatter. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The caretaker froze, tray balanced carefully in his hands. "Yes, sir?" John's voice was steady, though his hands gripped the tray just a little tighter. Robert gestured toward the piano, a sly grin tugging at his lips. "If you can play that piano, I'll marry you." The room burst into laughter. Glasses tilted, fans fluttered, whispers hissed like wind. Sophia, standing near the piano in a flowing silver dress, pressed her lips together in shock. Her eyes darted between Robert and John, as if silently pleading with Robert to stop. It was meant as a joke, a cruel one, the millionaire mocking the servant. John set the tray down on a nearby table. Slowly, carefully, his movements deliberate, as if time itself had slowed. The laughter still echoed around him, bouncing off the marble walls, pressing against his chest. He walked toward the piano. Every step made the crowd lean in closer, their laughter fading into murmurs. His hand slid across the polished surface, fingertips brushing the cool wood. He pulled the bench out and sat down. Silence. Even Robert tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Well, impress us, caretaker." John's fingers hovered above the keys, trembling for the briefest moment. Then he pressed down. The first note rang out, deep, pure, haunting. It cut through the silence like a blade of light in the dark. The room stilled. Then came the next notes, flowing together, weaving into something alive. His hands moved faster, with purpose, with fire. The melody was not just sound. It was a story, a confession, a prayer. Each chord filled the air with weight, each rise and fall pulling the listeners deeper. Sophia's eyes widened, tears shimmering at the corners. Evelyn clasped her hands to her chest. Even Michael, who had been laughing the loudest moments ago, leaned forward in disbelief. The caretaker played like he wasn't just touching keys, he was touching souls. Robert's grin faded. Slowly, his glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor, but no one even flinched. All eyes were fixed on John. And in that moment, the millionaire who mocked him had no power. Can you imagine the silence in that room? The shift from mockery to awe? One man, underestimated his whole life, now holding an entire ballroom captive with nothing but his hands. But here's the real question. What happens when the music stops? The last note hung in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. It shimmered, then dissolved into silence. For a moment, the ballroom felt frozen in time. No one moved. No one breathed. The chandeliers still glittered. The candles still burned. But the room itself seemed hollow, emptied of its arrogance, its noise, its cruel laughter. John's hands lingered on the keys. His shoulders rose and fell slowly, as though the music had poured out every ounce of his being. Then he lowered his gaze and stood, as if embarrassed by what had just happened. As if the spell he had cast wasn't already unbreakable. Sophia broke the silence first. A soft gasp, barely audible but enough. She stepped forward, her silver dress whispering across the marble floor. Her voice trembled, yet it carried, "John, that was extraordinary." The crowd stirred, whispers bubbling like a pot too long left on fire. Evelyn's eyes were shining, and Michael shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "Impossible. He plays like a master." Robert, however, was still, his face unreadable, though his clenched jaw betrayed him. A flush of anger, or was it shame, crept up his neck. His mocking bet had turned into a spectacle, and not one in his favor. "Enough!" Robert snapped suddenly, his voice cracking the fragile silence. It was passable. Nothing more. The guests glanced at each other nervously, their loyalty torn. Do they agree with their host, or admit what their hearts had just felt? John didn't answer. He simply looked at Robert. Just one look, steady and unafraid. And in that gaze was something Robert had never seen before from a servant. Quiet defiance. Sophia's hand trembled as she reached for John's sleeve. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she whispered, her voice thick with wonder. John hesitated. His lips parted as if to speak, but then he closed them again. His silence was louder than words. The tension thickened. A storm without thunder. Finally, Robert laughed, forced, hollow, sharp as broken glass. "A trick, that's all. You've been hiding this talent, HM? Perhaps I should have you play at all my parties. A performing servant. The guests would love it." Gasps rippled through the room, some horrified, others stunned by his cruelty. Sophia's eyes blazed, but John raised a hand gently, stopping her from speaking. And then, without another word, John walked away from the piano, past Robert, past the glittering chandeliers and marble pillars. Each step echoed, slow and steady, until the sound of his footsteps vanished down the hall. The ballroom was left hollow once again. But his music lingered. It lingered in the marrow of every guest who had heard it, echoing in their chests long after he had gone. Pause. Imagine being in that room. The way your heart would ache to hear more, yet the silence swallowed everything. Imagine the weight of a man walking away, after giving you a glimpse of something eternal. But here's the question. Was that the end of John's music? Or just the beginning of his story? The night outside was cold, but inside the mansion the air still trembled with the echo of John's music. Guests lingered in corners, whispering like conspirators, unable to shake what they had heard. Robert paced near the shattered glass on the marble floor, his jaw tight, his pride bleeding. The silence of his guests was worse than laughter. It was betrayal. They hadn't looked at him with admiration. They had looked at John. Sophia, meanwhile, slipped away from the crowd. She found John in the corridor, standing by an open window where the night air crept in, cool and sharp. His face was half in shadow, his eyes fixed on the moonlit gardens below. "You shouldn't have walked away," she whispered, her voice trembling with urgency. They were spellbound. "Do you understand what you've done?" John didn't turn. "I did nothing," he said softly. "Just played." She stepped closer, her hand brushing the windowsill. "No, you gave them something they'll never forget. And Robert, he'll never forgive you for it." Finally, John's gaze shifted to her. His eyes were darker than she expected, deep, carrying a sorrow she couldn't name. "Forgiveness is not something I expect from men like him." Pause. In the distance, Evelyn and Michael had followed, their curiosity pulling them into the corridor. Evelyn lowered her voice as she spoke to Michael. "Where did he learn to play like that?" "A caretaker. It makes no sense." Michael frowned. "It makes perfect sense if he's not who he claims to be." Sophia turned sharply toward them. "What are you suggesting?" Michael shrugged but kept his eyes on John. "No ordinary man plays with that kind of skill. That wasn't practice. That was pain. That was history." The words struck a nerve. John's shoulders stiffened, his fingers curling slightly as though they still remembered the keys. For a fleeting second, something raw flickered across his face. Memory, regret, maybe even loss. Robert's voice cut through the tension like a whip. He had followed, his polished shoes striking the marble in deliberate rhythm. So, a secret musician hiding among the servants. How convenient. Tell me, John, did you steal those skills the way you've stolen attention tonight? Sophia's jaw tightened. Robert, enough. But Robert ignored her, his eyes blazing. Or perhaps you were a failure. A man who once dreamed of stages, reduced now to carrying trays. Yes, that seems more likely. John met his stare with quiet defiance. Believe what you wish. For a moment, neither man moved. The air between them bristled, sharp as glass. Then Robert leaned closer, his voice low enough for only John to hear. Be careful. Men who outshine me do not last long. John didn't flinch. I've lasted this long. The corridor fell silent again. But this silence was different. It was heavy, dangerous, full of unspoken promises. Pause. Have you ever felt that moment when the past and present collide? When a man's hidden life presses against the mask he wears. The question is, what secret does John carry that could turn a night of music into a battle for survival? The storm outside had begun to grow. Rain hammered the windows of the mansion, each drop like a drumbeat, a warning. Inside, the guests tried to carry on with their evening, but the air had changed. Every whispered word circled back to John, the caretaker who played like a master. Sophia found herself restless, pacing her chambers. The sound of his music still clung to her, haunting her chest like an ache that wouldn't fade. Finally, unable to contain her curiosity, she sought him out. She found John in the servants' quarters, seated on a worn wooden chair, polishing his shoes with methodical precision. He looked up when she entered, but said nothing. His silence felt heavier than words. Why do you hide it? She asked softly. That gift. It's not something you stumble upon. It's who you are. John's hands stilled. His jaw tightened, as though he was fighting an answer. Finally, his voice came, low and unsteady. Because music cost me everything. Sophia blinked, her breath caught. What do you mean? He stared at the floor, eyes clouded with memories. Years ago, I was not a caretaker. I was a pianist. Concert halls, velvet seats, roaring applause. I lived for it, until ambition destroyed everything I loved. Sophia's heart thudded. What happened? John hesitated, then whispered, a rival, a man of wealth and power. He envied me, crushed my career, ruined my name. I was left with nothing but silence. And so I came here, to hide. The weight of his words hung in the air like smoke. Sophia's throat tightened. Was Robert the rival? Or someone like him? Before she could ask, a sharp knock rattled the door. Evelyn slipped inside, her expression pale. Sophia, John, you need to know. Robert is furious. He's speaking to his advisors right now. He's plotting something. He won't let this go. John's eyes darkened. Of course he won't. Thunder boomed outside, shaking the walls. Sophia shivered, torn between fear and defiance. Then you can't run anymore. You've hidden too long, John. Maybe it's time you fight. John looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, a small, grim smile touched his lips. Perhaps the music isn't finished after all. Pause. Have you ever felt the moment when a buried truth forces its way to the surface? Whether you're ready or not. But what happens when Robert makes his move, and John's past collides with his present? The following night, Robert hosted another gathering. But this time, the air was different, thick with anticipation, as though the guests had come not for wine and laughter, but for war. The piano sat in the center of the ballroom again, polished to perfection, waiting like a silent judge. Robert stood beside it, his smile too wide, his eyes too sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, lifting a glass. Tonight, we are honored by the presence of talent. Our very own caretaker has agreed to play for us again. A performance, for your delight. Gasps rippled. Guests exchanged glances. They all knew this wasn't generosity. It was a trap. John stepped forward. His plain clothes looked out of place against the grandeur, but his posture was steady, his gaze unwavering. He sat at the piano. Sophia caught his eye across the room, her silent plea reaching him. Be careful. The first notes rang out, and once again the room fell under his spell. But this time his music was different. Stronger, fiercer. It was no longer a confession, it was defiance. Each chord struck like a declaration, each crescendo a battle cry. The guests were riveted, their emotions surging with every rise and fall. Evelyn wept openly. Michael gripped the edge of his chair. Even the chandeliers seemed to tremble with the force of the sound. Robert's smile faltered. His hands clenched the stem of his glass until it cracked. John's music soared higher, carrying not just pain, but triumph. He poured his past into every key, his losses, his betrayals, his exile. And when the final note rang out, it wasn't silence that followed. It was thunderous applause. The guests rose to their feet, their cheers shaking the hall. Sophia's hands clapped furiously, tears streaming down her face. Robert stood frozen, pale with rage. His kingdom of pride had been shattered by the very man he mocked. John rose from the piano, his voice steady as he looked directly at Robert. "You can strip me of titles. You can take my wealth, my name, my stage. But music, that will always be mine." The ballroom erupted once more, voices chanting his name, drowning out Robert's fury. For the first time in years, John no longer hid. He stood in the light, unbroken, unstoppable. Pause. Have you ever witnessed a moment when truth cannot be silenced, no matter who tries to bury it? And here's the thought I'll leave you with. If you had a gift the world once tried to destroy, would you dare to bring it back into the light?